Hello and welcome to part 6 of this series, answering your questions on worship, following on from the recent teaching series that we did. And this question that's come in is asking, what is the difference between something called a word of knowledge and prophecy more generally? And I think this kind of comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul is listing out the gifts that we can have. And he says, for to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom. So we've got the utterance of wisdom, and to another, the utterance of knowledge. So I think that's where that kind of idea of a word of knowledge comes. And then a bit later on, he says, to another, the working of miracles, to another, prophecy. And so it seems like he's kind of separating out these gifts as kind of the giving of wisdom from God, the giving of knowledge and prophecy. And so the question is kind of, what's the difference between these things? Probably the first thing to say on this is that most commentators that I've read on this passage would just say that, generally speaking, would group them together and call them something collective, like the revelatory gifts. Essentially the gifts that God gives where he is revealing something to us that we wouldn't know. And I think probably the Bible doesn't seem to, in any place really, draw clearly distinct boundary markers between this is this and this is that. And so trying to work out, okay, is this a word of knowledge? Is this prophecy? Is this wisdom? I don't think that's the primary concern of the Bible. I think what it's trying to communicate to us is God wants to speak to us. He wants to reveal things to us. Probably the most helpful way of thinking about it, I think, is that something like a word of knowledge, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment, and wisdom, I think these kind of fall under the more general category of the prophetic or prophecy. So then when Paul goes on to talk about prophecy in 1 Corinthians 14 and emphasising that in worship, I think he's kind of talking quite broadly about what he would want to expect. Just expect God to speak and expect God to and that might look like a variety of different things. A word of knowledge in its kind of common usage in churches like ours and probably within our church is God speaking certain things to people, revealing facts or situations that individuals might be currently going through. And in order to kind of just see, whilst I don't think the Bible's trying to draw a really clear demarcation between this is a word of knowledge, this is a prophecy, and this is how you should understand what those things are, I think it might just be helpful for us to look in the book of Acts, just at a couple of examples of this kind of gift of the revelatory things of God and the gifts of God working in his church from the beginning. So in Acts chapter 9, when Saul gets converted and Christ comes and blinds him and he has an encounter, he then goes to Damascus. And then in verse 10 it picks up and says, now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias, and he said, here I am, Lord. And the Lord said to him, rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. And so what's going on here is God is not doing something prophetic in the sense that we might popularly think of prophecy, of telling the future, but he's just revealing circumstances that Ananias wouldn't otherwise have known right now. So he's saying, Ananias, right now there is somebody on a street called Straight and at the house of Judah. So he's giving all these different bits of information. Go to the street called Straight, the house of Judah. Look for a man from Tarsus. He's called Saul and he's praying. That is 5 pieces of information. Go and find him. And then when you do, I want you to pray for him and lay your hands on him. And so he's kind of given all of these things of, you will know the right person, and I'm revealing that to you by these bits of information. And that's often how we see God working in our worship times. And what's commonly known as a word of knowledge is someone might say, oh, I think there's somebody here and they've got shoulder pain and their mum's name is Pat and they drive a yellow Skoda. And it's God just revealing these bits of information so that we can know God is picking us out if we have those characteristics. And of course, we prophesy in part. Not always every single one of those bits of information will line up with us, even if God is trying to get our attention. And so we sometimes have to discern and weigh. And I've done previous teaching and videos on that. And then just a couple of chapters later, we have then Agabus, one of the days, in verse 27, chapter 11. Now in those days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, And one of these, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be great famine over all the world. And then this took place in the days of Claudius. So clearly prophesied correctly that a famine would come. And again, this is something then completely different. It's God revealing something that will happen on a global scale, so not individual now, on a global scale, something that will happen in the future. So it hasn't yet happened, but will. And so here I think we just see the range in a couple of chapters of how this prophetic gift can work. And so these are the sorts of things that we should expect in our individual lives as we're hearing from God, in our church life as we're sharing together. Prophecy, I think Paul is saying here, it's just not confined to one thing and one type of thing. And I think he's almost using this language of referring to it a few times. So just perhaps emphasize some of that. If it might be God revealing something happening right now in an individual, or he might be speaking about future things that are to come. Let's be open to however God might want to speak. So I hope this is helpful, and I hope that we'll look forward to seeing you next time.